No one in the Whitfield house ever believed a single letter could take a daughter apart and put her back together as someone new. But that is exactly what happened on a gray morning in the spring of 1878, when a rider from Larkspur Hollow came up the drive with a folded paper sealed in wax, and everything in that house changed before the coffee even had time to cool. Nathaniel Whitfield read the letter twice at the breakfast table, and the second time, something shifted behind his eyes. It was not joy exactly. It was closer to the look a man gets when he finds a way to win without doing any of the work himself. His wife, Louisa, set down her cup and leaned in close enough that her sleeve dragged through the butter. Their two daughters, Josephine and Adeline, sat across the table with their hair still pinned from the night before, waiting for something to laugh about, the way they always did. Gideon Hart had written to ask for a wife. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. He owned the largest cattle spread this side of the Bitterroot Range, more horses than most towns had people, and a reputation so solid that bankers in Helena spoke it like a blessing. Any father in the territory would have wept with gratitude to see that name on a letter addressed to his house. Nathaniel Whitfield nearly did, until he read further and saw which daughter Gideon Hart had asked for. Not Josephine with her copper curls and her practiced laugh, not Adeline, who could charm a room without ever saying anything true. He had asked by name for Mercy. The silence lasted only a breath before it broke into laughter, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from people who have never once had to sit alone with what they really are. Josephine pressed her hand over her mouth, but it did nothing to hide the sound. Adeline actually clapped, like she was watching a trick at the county fair. Louisa Whitfield laughed too, though she tried to swallow it back into something more polite, and failed. Mercy Whitfield heard none of this at first, because Mercy was where she always was in the early hours, in the back room with her grandmother Opal, wringing out a cloth in the wash basin and laying it gently across the old woman's forehead. Opal's breathing had gone thin these last weeks, and Mercy had taken to sitting with her before sunrise, humming low, tucking the quilt in tight against the cold that came through the floorboards. She heard the laughter through the wall and thought nothing of it. Laughter in that house rarely had anything to do with her. It never had. But this time it did. In the front room, the plan came together fast, the way cruelty always moves faster than kindness. "This is perfect," Nathaniel said, folding the letter along its crease like he was closing a deal. "Hart thinks he is getting himself a quiet, obedient bride. Let him find out what he actually asked for. He does not know the first thing about her." Louisa dabbed at her eyes, still smiling. "He will be too far away to send her back once he understands. And we will finally be rid of the trouble," Adeline added, twisting a curl around her finger. Josephine agreed it was the funniest thing that had happened in that house in years, sending Mercy off like a parcel nobody wanted delivered, and letting some rich stranger discover for himself exactly what a burden felt like. Mercy stood just outside the doorway with a basket of wet laundry pressed against her hip, and she heard every word. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She only stood there while the cold water soaked through her apron, and her heart beat so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it. Burden, trouble, rid of her. Words she had carried her whole life, worn smooth from years of hearing them, and yet somehow this time they landed sharper than ever before, because this time they came with a plan attached, a plan to hand her off like something broken that another man could be tricked into taking. She thought of every hard winter she had worked through without complaint, every night she had sat up with Opal so her mother could sleep, every time she had spoken up in town when someone was being cheated or shamed, and no one else would say a word. None of it had ever been enough. None of it had ever once been seen. Something in her chest went very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still right before a storm breaks. She set the laundry basket down slowly so it would not make a sound, and she stepped back from the wall. Her hands were shaking, But underneath the shaking there was something else now, something clear and cold and steady, like frost forming on glass. If her family wanted to be rid of her, then she would go. But she would not go as the girl they believed her to be. She would not leave that house broken. She would leave it standing straight, with her chin level and her eyes dry, and whatever waited for her on the other side of that decision, she would meet it as herself. That evening at supper, Nathaniel cleared his throat and announced the news as though it were a gift he alone had arranged. "Mercy," he said, "you have received an offer of marriage." Josephine and Adeline exchanged a look across the table, the kind of look that said they were already imagining how the story would end. Louisa reached over and patted Mercy's hand, her voice syrup-sweet. "Such a fortunate turn for you, dear. A blessing you certainly did not earn." Mercy set her fork down carefully beside her plate, "And I have accepted," she said. "It was not a question." "Of course you have," Nathaniel said, pleased. "You leave for the Hart Ranch on Monday. Your intended wishes to receive you then." 5 days. Mercy repeated the number silently to herself as she finished her meal without another word, without a single tear, while her family watched her, disappointed, it seemed, that she had not given them the reaction they wanted. She would not give them that either. Later that night, lying awake in the small room she had slept in since childhood, Mercy stared at the ceiling and let herself wonder, just once, whether being sent away might not be the punishment her family believed it to be, whether it might instead be the first door she had ever been allowed to walk through on her own. She thought about the name on the letter. Gideon Hart. A man she had never spoken to, never even properly seen, and yet a man who had looked past 2 daughters known across the territory for their beauty and their charm, and had asked, deliberately, by name for her. It made no sense to anyone in that house. But some quiet part of Mercy wondered if it made sense to no one, because no one in that house had ever truly looked at her at all. 5 days remained before the wagon would carry her out past the fence line, past the fields she had worked barefoot as a girl, and into a life no one had prepared her for. She did not know yet what waited at the end of that road, whether it would be another kind of cage or something she had never once been permitted to hope for. But somewhere beyond the ridge, in a homestead built by 10 years of hard sunrises, a man was already watching the horizon, thinking of a woman he had never forgotten, and waiting for Monday with a patience that had cost him more than anyone knew. Monday came in gray and cold, with a wind that carried the smell of turned earth all the way from the fields Mercy had worked since she was old enough to carry a bucket. She stood at the gate with her trunk beside her, wearing the plain brown traveling dress her mother had chosen specifically because it would not draw attention, and waited while the driver checked the harness on the 2 bay horses one last time. No one came out to say goodbye. She had not expected them to. The ride to Larkspur Hollow took most of the day, the wagon rattling over ruts and through dry creek beds, and Mercy spent the hours watching the land change around her, the fences growing sturdier, the fields greener, the cattle fatter, and more numerous the closer they came to Gideon Hart's ground. By the time the homestead came into view, the sun had dropped low and gold across the hills, and Mercy felt her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The house sat wide and solid against the sky, built of good timber that had clearly been chosen with care, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and smoke curling steady from the chimney. It was the kind of house, raised by hands, that did not quit halfway through a job. But Mercy barely had time to take in the house at all, because a man stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, and every thought in her head went quiet at once. He was taller than she had imagined, broad through the shoulders, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his boots gray with dust from a day's work. But it was his eyes that stopped her, steady and brown and strangely familiar, though she could not place why. He came down the porch steps at an easy pace, in no hurry at all, and stopped a respectful distance from the wagon. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice was low and even. Welcome to Larkspur Hollow. Mercy managed a small nod, her throat too tight for words at first. Mr. Hart, she finally said, thank you for having me. He lifted her trunk down himself without calling for help, and the ease of it, a wealthy man doing his own lifting, struck her as strange in a way she could not yet explain. Come inside, he said. You have had a long ride. There is coffee on the stove. Inside, the house surprised her further. It was simple but warm in a way her family's parlor had never once managed to be, no matter how much silver sat on the shelves. A fire burned low in the hearth. Shelves along one wall held more books than Mercy had seen outside of a schoolhouse. The windows let in the last of the evening light without a single curtain drawn to block it out, as though the man who lived here had nothing to hide from anyone. Gideon poured her coffee and sat across from her, close enough to talk but far enough that she did not feel crowded, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside, one of the horses shifted against the fence rail, and somewhere a barn door creaked once in the wind. Mercy set her cup down carefully. Mr. Hart, may I ask you something plainly? Please do, he said. Why me? You could have written to either of my sisters. Everyone in the territory knows their names before mine. Gideon did not look away from her, and there was nothing in his face that resembled the pity she had braced herself for. Because I already knew yours, he said quietly. 5 years passed, in the market at Willow Bend. Do you remember an old peddler named Tobias, the one they tried to run off for a theft he never committed? Mercy's breath caught. I remember, she said slowly. Nobody believed him. They were going to take the sheriff to him. You believed him, Gideon said. You stood between that old man and a crowd twice your size and would not move until someone listened. You paid the difference out of your own pocket so the accusation would end right there. I was standing at the edge of that crowd, and I never forgot it. Mercy stared at him, the coffee forgotten in her hands. That was 5 years ago. I did not even know anyone had noticed. I noticed, Gideon said. I have thought of that day more times than I can count. Not because you were beautiful, though you were, but because you were the only person in that whole crowd willing to lose something for the sake of what was right. I did not write to your family for a wife who would sit quiet and smile. I wrote for the woman who stood in that market and would not back down. Something in Mercy's chest cracked open, slow and painful, like ice giving way on a river in early spring. No one has ever, she started, and could not finish the sentence. Gideon leaned forward slightly. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it plainly. Your family was eager to send you here. I could tell that much from the tone of the letters that came before you did. I did not understand why until I watched you climb down from that wagon just now, looking like you expected to be sent back before supper. Mercy's hands tightened around her cup. They think I am a burden, she said quietly, the words coming easier than she expected, maybe because his eyes held no judgment in them at all. They think I cause trouble because I will not stay silent when something is wrong. They laughed when they read your letter because they could not believe you had asked for me instead of one of them. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone low and certain, the way a man speaks when he has turned a thought over many times before saying it aloud. Mercy, people who have never once told the truth are frightened of those who tell it easily. People who profit from looking away are troubled by those who will not look away. Your family did not send you here because you were wrong about anything. They sent you here because you were right, and being right made you inconvenient to them. Mercy felt the room tilt slightly, not from dizziness, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being understood by a stranger more completely than she had ever been understood by her own blood. I did not ask for an obedient wife, Gideon went on. I asked for the woman I saw in that market, the one with fire in her, even when the fire cost her something. Mercy looked down at her own hands, work roughened and calloused, the same hands her mother had once called an embarrassment at a church social loud enough for others to hear. Gideon's gaze followed hers, and instead of looking away, he studied them the way a man studies something worth admiring. "Those hands have done real work," he said. "That is nothing to hide." Mercy swallowed hard, fighting the sudden heat behind her eyes. "You do not know me, Mr. Hart. Not truly. 5 years and one afternoon in a market does not make you know a person." "Then let us fix that," Gideon said simply. "I am not asking you to marry a stranger tomorrow. I am asking for time. A few weeks, no pressure attached to any of it. We will learn each other honestly, and at the end of it, if you decide this is not the life you want, I will see you safely wherever you wish to go, and no shame will follow you for it." Mercy lifted her eyes to his, searching his face for the trick she had been raised to expect from every kind word anyone ever offered her. She found none. "You would give me a choice," she said, almost disbelieving. "Of course," Gideon said. "You are a woman, not cargo delivered by wagon. I intend to treat you as one from this day forward, whatever you decide." Something in Mercy's chest, some old and heavy weight she had carried since she was a girl too small to understand why her own family flinched from her, shifted just slightly, like a stone easing free from ground that had held it too long. "Then I accept your offer of time," she said quietly. "We will learn each other honestly, Mr. Hart, and see where the truth of it leads us." Gideon's smile was small, but it reached all the way to those steady brown eyes. "Good," he said. "That is all I have ever wanted, from the very first day I asked for you by name." Outside, the wind picked up and set the porch lantern swinging gently on its hook, throwing long shadows across the floorboards, and neither of them noticed how late the hour had grown, both of them too caught up in the strange, fragile beginning of something neither had expected to find. Neither of them yet knew how quickly those few careful weeks would turn into something neither could hold back, nor how soon the peace they were building would be tested by the very family who had thrown Mercy away like something worth nothing at all. Part 3. The weeks that followed changed something in Mercy that she could not have named if anyone had asked her to. Gideon kept his word exactly as he had given it. He asked nothing of her that she did not offer freely, and every morning she woke in the small guest room at Larkspur Hollow, she found herself a little less braced for the cruelty she had spent her whole life expecting to arrive eventually, the way weather always does. It was Gideon's habit to walk the property at first light, and on the third morning, Mercy rose early enough to join him without being asked. He did not seem surprised to find her waiting by the porch rail, only handed her a second cup of coffee he had apparently poured out of habit, and together they walked the fence line while the sun came up pale gold over the ridge. He showed her the cattle first, then the horse barn, then the long stretch of pasture that ran down toward the creek, and Mercy found herself doing something she had rarely been permitted to do in her father's house. She spoke her mind plainly, and no one told her to be quiet. "Your water troughs run dry too fast in the dry months," she said one afternoon, watching a ranch hand haul buckets from the well for the third time that day. "If you dug a channel between them here and here, gravity would do half that man's work for him." Gideon studied the layout of the troughs for a long moment, then looked at her with something like surprise, though not the kind she was used to. "You are right," he said. "I have looked at that same problem for 2 summers and never once seen it." It became a pattern between them, not courtship exactly, not yet, but something steadier and rarer, 2 people learning the shape of each other through work and conversation rather than empty flattery. Gideon asked her opinion on the new schoolhouse he hoped to build for the children of the families working his land, and Mercy found herself sketching out a floor plan on the back of a feed ledger before she realized what she was doing. He listened to every word of it, made notes, changed nothing without asking her first. In the evenings they sat on the porch while the light faded, and slowly, carefully, Mercy began to tell him things she had never told another living soul. About her grandmother Opal, who had been the only one in that house who ever looked at her with anything resembling warmth, and who had died only a season before the letter arrived, though Mercy had not told her family how much that loss had hollowed her out, because she had learned long ago that her grief was not welcome in that house any more than her joy had been. Gideon listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only, "She sounds like she knew exactly what she had in you." Mercy had to look away then, out toward the darkening hills, because no one had ever said something so simple and so true about her before. One evening, 3 weeks into her stay, they sat together on the porch steps watching the stars come up thick and bright over the ridge, the kind of sky that only showed itself fully out here, far from any town's lamplight. Gideon was quiet for a long while, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a rough edge to it that Mercy had not heard from him before. "Mercy, I have a confession to make," he said. Her heart went still. "What is it?" "I did not plan on this," he said. "I asked for you because of what I saw in that market 5 years ago, and I told myself that would be enough, that I would build a fair and honest marriage with a woman I respected, and that would be the whole of it. I did not plan on falling for you the way I have." Mercy's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "Every evening this past week," she admitted quietly, "I have found myself hoping you would come find me after supper. I did not let myself call it anything until just now." Gideon turned to look at her fully then, and in the starlight his eyes held none of the careful distance he had kept since the day she arrived. "May I?" he asked, and Mercy understood the question without him needing to finish it. She nodded, and when he kissed her, it was slow and certain, nothing like the rushed, careless things she had overheard her sisters giggling about after dances back home. It felt instead like something settling into place after being lost for a long time. When they finally drew apart, Gideon rested his forehead gently against hers, his breath unsteady. "Mercy," he said, "I want to marry you. Not because of the letter I sent, not because of any arrangement between our families. I want you, plainly and completely, for exactly who you are." Tears rose in Mercy's eyes, but they carried none of the old grief she had grown so used to carrying. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her, not despite what she was, but entirely because of it. "Yes," she whispered, "I choose you too, Gideon Hart. I have never been more certain of anything." They were married on a clear Saturday morning 6 weeks later, in the small whitewashed church at Larkspur Hollow, with the bell ringing out over hills still damp from the night's rain. The pews filled with people who had come to matter to Mercy in ways her own family never had. Ranch hands and their wives came with their children scrubbed and combed for the occasion. Neighboring families from 3 ranches over arrived with baskets of food they had spent all week preparing. An old woman from town, whose grandson Mercy had once nursed through a fever nobody else had time for, came forward before the ceremony and pressed a small embroidered handkerchief into her hands, her eyes wet. Her own family did not come. A single letter arrived 2 days before the wedding, cold and brief, offering congratulations in a hand Mercy recognized as her mother's, careful and looping and utterly without warmth. Mercy read it once, standing by the kitchen stove, and then fed it to the fire without a flicker of hesitation. She had expected to feel something sharp in that moment. Instead, she felt only a quiet, settled peace, the kind that comes after a wound has finally stopped aching. Gideon stood at the front of the church in his best coat, and when Mercy walked toward him in a simple dress of pale blue, her hair braided back the way her grandmother had once taught her, something in his face made the whole church go still. He would tell her later, long after the ceremony, that in that moment he had thought only one thing, over and over like a prayer. That her family's cruelty had very nearly cost him the finest thing he would ever have in his life, and he intended to spend every day proving he understood exactly what he had been given. Their vows held no false promises. Gideon swore to honor her voice as much as her heart, to never ask her to be smaller than she was for the sake of anyone's comfort. Mercy swore to stand beside him honestly, as an equal in every sense, in the good seasons and the hard ones alike. When they kissed before the gathered crowd, it sealed something far larger than a marriage. It sealed a life built on truth, the very thing her own family had tried so hard to punish out of her. The celebration ran long into the evening, with fiddle music drifting across the yard and children chasing fireflies between the wagons, and Mercy laughed more freely that night than she had in years, maybe in her whole life. Gideon kept one hand at the small of her back through most of it, as though he needed the steady proof of her presence beside him. But peace, Mercy would learn before the year was through, rarely stays undisturbed for long, especially not when the people who once cast someone away discover, too late, exactly what they gave up. It was nearly 4 months later, on a cold afternoon with frost still silvering the fence posts, when a familiar carriage came rattling up the long road toward Larkspur Hollow, and Mercy, standing at the kitchen window with flour still on her hands, felt her whole body go tense at the sight of it because she recognized the driver, and she recognized, even from a distance, the stiff, proud way her father always held. His shoulders when he wanted something he did not believe he deserved. Part 4. The carriage rolled to a stop at the bottom of the porch steps, and Mercy set down her flour-dusted hands on her apron and walked out onto the porch before the driver had even finished tying off the horses. Gideon, who had been mending a section of fence near the barn, straightened when he saw the carriage and came across the yard at an unhurried but deliberate pace, reaching her side just as Nathaniel Whitfield climbed down and removed his hat. He looked smaller than Mercy remembered. His coat, once sharp and well-kept, hung looser on him now, and there was a grayness to his face that had nothing to do with the cold. His eyes moved past Mercy toward the barns, the healthy cattle grazing beyond the fence, the new schoolhouse standing fresh-timbered near the road, the whole thriving weight of everything Larkspur Hollow had become, and something in his expression flickered, envy or shame. Mercy could not tell which, and found she no longer cared to guess. "Mercy," he said, turning his hat over in his hands, "I need to speak with you." She did not step down from the porch. "Say what you came to say, Father." He swallowed, and for a moment the old habit of command rose in his shoulders before falling away again, as though he had remembered too late that it no longer carried any weight here. "Our family is in serious trouble," he said. "The land office found irregularities in some of my dealings. There is an investigation. If it goes badly, we could lose the house, everything we have built." Everything you built by cheating people who trusted you, Mercy thought, though she did not say it. She had warned him once, years ago, about the men he did business with, the deals that never quite added up, and he had told her then that a girl her age had no business questioning her father's affairs. She remembered that clearly. She wondered if he did. Nathaniel pressed on, his voice thinning with the effort of asking for something he had never once believed he would need to ask for. "I was hoping, given your husband's position, that you might speak to him. Alone, temporary, just until matters settle. Family helps family, Mercy." Gideon's hand came to rest lightly at the small of Mercy's back, steady and warm, not pulling her forward or holding her behind him, simply present, the way he always was, letting her decide how she wanted to meet this moment. Mercy felt the old fear rise briefly in her chest, the reflex of a girl who had spent years learning to shrink herself smaller to avoid her father's temper. And then, just as quickly, she felt it settle, because that girl did not live in this house anymore. "You sent me away as a joke," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You laughed when Gideon's letter came, because you believed you were handing him a burden and ridding yourselves of one at the same time. You wanted him to suffer for choosing wrong. Now you stand in front of that same man's house and ask him to save you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "We misjudged the situation," he said, "but you are still my daughter." "No," Mercy said quietly. "A daughter is loved. A daughter is protected and valued for exactly who she is. I was never any of those things in your house, Father, and we both know it." Gideon spoke then, his voice even and unhurried, carrying none of the heat Nathaniel's own voice had held moments before. "Mr. Whitfield, my wife has told you the truth, plainly and without cruelty, which is more consideration than your household ever showed her. You did not send her here out of love. You sent her here because you underestimated what she was worth, and you underestimated me as well." Nathaniel's face reddened. "Are you going to stand there and let her speak to her own father this way?" "I married her," Gideon said, "because she has never once been afraid to speak the truth, even when it cost her. If the truth is difficult for you to hear now, that is not something she owes you an apology for." Nathaniel turned back to Mercy, and for a moment something almost pleading crossed his face, the closest thing to vulnerability Mercy had ever seen from him. "Please," he said, "think of your mother, think of your sisters." Mercy thought of them briefly, of the laughter that had filled that front room the morning Gideon's letter arrived, of every year she had spent working herself raw for people who saw her only as something to be managed and eventually discarded. "I did think of you," she said. "For years, I thought of nothing but earning a place in that house. I warned you when I saw the danger in the deals you were making. You told me to be quiet. Now the consequences you were warned about have arrived, and you are asking the daughter you tried to give away to undo them." Nathaniel opened his mouth again, but no words came this time. Something in his face seemed to finally understand, or at least to stop pretending not to understand, that whatever leverage he believed his blood still held over her had run out somewhere between that cold morning and this one. "If I help you now," Mercy said, more gently than she felt, "you will only return to the same practices that brought this trouble to your door in the first place. I will not be part of that, not with my name and not with my husband's." "You will regret this," Nathaniel said, though the words carried none of their old force, only the brittle sound of a man grasping for something already gone. "No," Mercy said. "I regret only how many years I spent believing I needed your approval to know my own worth." Nathaniel stood there a moment longer and then, finding nothing left to say, climbed back into the carriage. The driver snapped the reins, and the wheels kicked up a thin cloud of frost-dampened dust as the carriage turned back down the long road, growing smaller against the gray winter fields until it disappeared past the ridge entirely. Mercy let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Gideon turned her gently by the shoulders until she faced him, his eyes searching hers with quiet concern. "You owed him nothing," he said. "I know," Mercy said, "but I keep waiting to feel something more, anger maybe, or grief. I only feel tired." "That is not a small thing to feel. After carrying it this long," Gideon said, and drew her against him, his chin resting lightly against the top of her head, while the wind moved cold and steady across the yard. That evening, they sat together at the kitchen table in the warm glow of the lamp, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the schoolhouse and barns dark and quiet against the winter sky outside. Mercy watched Gideon laugh at something one of the ranch hands had said to him earlier in the day, watched the firelight move across the familiar, steady lines of his face, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she had never once felt inside her father's house. Belonging. Purpose. A place that had been built, patiently and honestly, just for her. She thought of her family, their cruelty and their pride, the years of small cutting words, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she carried no wish to return to any of it, not even now, watching them fall exactly as far as their own choices had always been leading them. They had sent her away believing they were ridding themselves of a burden. Instead, without ever meaning to, they had delivered her directly into the life of a man who had waited 10 patient years to find a woman worth building that life beside. Gideon reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb moving gently over her calloused knuckles. "You know," he said, "your family never once understood what they had." "What is that?" Mercy asked. "The finest thing in that whole house," he said, and they were too blind and too proud to ever see it clearly. Mercy's eyes warmed, and she asked softly, "And what did you see that day in the market, 5 years before any of this began?" Gideon smiled, the same steady smile she had come to know so well these past months. "Everything I had ever wanted," he said, "and never once believed I would be lucky enough to find." Outside, the wind settled quiet over the frost-covered fields, and inside, the fire burned low and warm, and Mercy Hart, no longer the daughter nobody wanted, no longer the burden her family had tried so hard to be rid of, sat in the home she had built with her own 2 hands and her own unbroken heart, and finally, completely, felt at peace.